Thank you everyone for joining today for the 2021 Elizabeth Munves Sherman Lecture in Gender and Sexuality Studies. Elizabeth Sherman has been a foundational contributor to the Pembroke and Gender and Sexuality Studies here at Brown University. So thank you. And it is my pleasure to welcome our guest speaker today, Keisha-Khan Perry, Associate Professor of Africana Studies here at Brown University. When I arrived at Brown 2.5 years ago, there were several faculty members that I was both excited to be joining and frankly a little intimidated by their groundbreaking work around questions of gender and sexuality in the field of Brazilian studies. Keisha-Khan was one of those individuals. The short time I have been at Brown, my interactions with Keisha-Khan have only reinforced and augmented my respect for her foundational work in the field, her service to the profession, her dedication to the students, and more generally, her generosity. So thank you, Keisha-Khan, for joining us today. Keisha-Khan received her BS in Spanish and Women's Studies from Georgetown University and her MA and PhD in social anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin. Her research focuses on questions of race, gender, and politics in the Americas, urban geography, citizenship, and the interrelationship between scholarship, pedagogy, and political engagement. She has conducted extensive research in Brazil, the United States, Spanish America, and the Caribbean. Her first book, Black Against the Land Grab, The Fight for Racial Justice in Brazil, was published with University of Minnesota Press and won the National Women's Studies Association's Gloria Anzaldúa Book Award. The book studies Black women's activism and leadership in neighborhood associations such as Gamboa de Baixo in Salvador, Bahia. The book specifically considers reinterpretations of racial and gender identities in urban spaces, the relationship between state policing and mass evictions, as well as between environmental justice movements and the land and housing rights struggles in Brazil. Professor Perry's current research project, The Historical Paradox of Citizenship, Black Land Ownership and Loss in the Americas, is a continuation of her research in documenting and analyzing the political paradox of Black land loss and ownership in relationship to the material articulation of citizenship in Brazil, Jamaica, and the United States. The title of Dr. Perry's talk today is Global Housing and Land Justice as a Black Feminist Imperative. Please join me in welcoming Keisha-Khan Perry.
Thank you. I can hear the applause. So, boa tarde, buenos tardes, good afternoon, bon après-midi. That's the extent of my French for today. Good evening to those of you who are living in countries where it is now already nighttime. Greetings to Kiriana Dube, who said she was going to join us from Zimbabwe. And I see Pablo Lopez Oro on here, who may be in Honduras at this time, I'm not sure. But I want to say that I'm speaking with you from the Narragansett lands, where the Aboriginal struggles for recognition and reparations continues to this day. I would like to thank Professor Jeremy Lennon and Professors Lennon and Susan Stewart Steinberg for inviting me to give the 2021 Elizabeth Munves Sherman Lecture in Gender and Sexuality Studies. It is quite an honor to follow in the footsteps of my distinguished colleagues such as Lena Frizzetti, Trisha Rose, James Green, and numerous others. And it was such an ambitious title when I first sent it, but hopefully it's the beginning of something that I've been working on over the last few years. I want to also thank the faculty and students who are in attendance and all of you who are not discouraged by the Zoom fatigue that we're all suffering. I'm fortunate for the research support of the Watson Institute Barker Award recipient, Jack Doughty, who has been working with me this semester to look up questions of housing, policing, and mass incarceration. So thank you, Jack, if he's out there. I also want to give a special shout out to the energetic and committed students currently enrolled in AFRI 1941, Archiving the African Diaspora, the life and works of Anani Gizenyo this semester. As we are living in the ever-changing landscape of the coronavirus pandemic, particularly the mass death and dying as a result of poor state management of our public health systems, it's easy to understand our current conditions as spectacular moments in modern history. But spending hours each week with Ashley, Kaya, Jason, Jordan, Joyce, Karen, Kuno, Ryan, Sinit, Teo, Yanu, and Yuma, sifting through over 50 years of Professor Anani's papers, the newspaper clippings, the student papers, the posters, and the many handwritten notes, has been a collective reminder that our experiences over the past year are an extension of a long global history of racial and gender violence. I dedicate my talk today to my dear friend and colleague, Anani, whose intellectual legacy in Afro-Latin and Afro-Brazilian studies, I hope to uphold his legacy in the years ahead. Anani taught me about the diasporic travels of Lelia Gonzalez and Teresa Santos. And for those of you who knew him, he always repeated the famous words of Ghana's Prime Minister and President, Kwame Nkrumah, that would later be repeated by Maurice Bishop and many throughout the Caribbean islands: forever, forward ever, backward never. I take these words as my guide, as I hope that my research will advance the basic struggle for housing as a human right that I see as one of the core issues that should preoccupy feminist thought and social movements today. When I started my anthropological research on housing and land struggles against evictions in Brazil over 20 years ago, committed to activist and collaborative approaches to research, Black women's grassroots activists played a key role in designing my research process that was in dialogue with the collective action of vibrant neighborhood movements taking place. How I arrived at the research was a question they asked me frequently. This dialogic process, Charlie Hale stated, is a basic criteria of collective problem solving in the social sciences and the politically situated character of all knowledge production. Hale writes, quote, "The practice of activist research asks us to identify our deepest ethical political convictions and to let them drive the formulation of our research objectives," unquote. Perusing archival documents, newspaper articles, old and new city maps, designing and contributing to survey data collection, and participating in the collective analysis of community studies, I was asked by local activists, as Hale also insisted, to make my politics explicit and upfront, reflecting honestly and systematically on how they have shaped my understanding of the social problems at hand and how I could put my research to the service of the collective movement. This kind of people-driven research has forced me to ask the question of what it means to carry out research with communities with whom I identify ethically and politically over a sustained period of time. Feminist anthropologist Dana Ian Davis defines feminist activist ethnography as, quote, drawing on methodological strategies that embrace the everyday experiences of people, especially those forced to live on the margins, as epistemologically valid. Feminist knowledge production, when linked to methodological strategies, should unravel issues of power and include interventions that help move towards social justice, unquote. These dialogues with activists in Brazil were initially concerned with procuring epistemological validation, and this is using Dana Ian Davis's term, especially to make a clearer connection to the political project of fighting for housing rights. Many of these Black diaspora communities have been over-researched, and I'm using a term that some Palestinian scholars have used, oftentimes documenting aspects of their daily lives they do not deem important. Over the last 15 years, as a teacher of Black feminism, urban politics, critical theories of race and diaspora, and social movements at Brown, this connection has become more about challenging the myth of Brazilian exceptionalism and invigorating broader conversations about a hemispheric approach to understanding class-based gendered racism. The question has been about how my research aligns with my feminist sensibilities, but also how the collaborative research process has awakened my own consciousness and understanding of the collective Black experience in the African diaspora. Today's presentation attempts to provide a diasporic view of Black women as political protagonists in the movement for housing and land justice, leading what I consider to be social movement classrooms aimed at building just cities that democratize basic citizenship rights and resources. The fight for the right to exist, the right to adequate housing and infrastructure, the right to self-govern has become the center of my feminist research, because those are the issues Black women have articulated that they consider to be important to their left, feminist, and Black movements. When I applied to graduate school in 1998, I just gave away my age a little. I proposed a comparative study of cultural practices of Maroons in Jamaica and cultural groups, such as Ilhaé in Bahia, Brazil. It was an extension of my work as a student of literatures in Spanish, linguistics, and women's studies. I could recite the poetry of Federico Garcia Lorca, Llanto por Ignacio Sanchez Mejías, translated as the lament of the death of the bullfighter, was one of my favorite poems, and I chose Buenos Aires for study abroad because I love the Argentine short story writer Luis Borges. At the same time, I wrote papers on the silent marches against sexual violence, the weekly protests of the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, and a thesis on indigenous women in armed struggle focused on the Zapatistas. That thesis was foundational in my early research on gender-based transformation in social movements, and I've also held on to 2 other final papers for my college classes. One was a paper for my feminist practicum course that provided a critical reflection of my work at a women's homeless shelter, and another from a creative writing course in which I imagined a conversation between a mother and her daughter about to deal with homelessness. While being guided into literature and linguistics by my faculty mentors, my feminist research inquiries in housing and land struggles reflected a commitment to what Dinah Ian Davis also calls a politics of deep radical empathy concerned with social justice and advocacy. When I started graduate school in the fall of 1999 and proposed to study Black women's leadership and participation in grassroots movement in Brazil, I was fully aware that I was studying their lives of struggle as well as I was studying mine. Just need to change the view. I would also like to take you further back to the end of August in 1993. I was 16 years old and had just returned from a visit with my family in Jamaica, the country of my birth. My skin was glowing from weeks of sitting in the sun, eating endless variety of mangoes, jackfruit, ackee, roast breadfruit, and sugarcane. I never grew tired of the surprise involved in sucking on guineps and tamarind that my aunts bought regularly from street vendors on their way back home. I can distinctly remember that my cousin combed my hair so tight that each braid lifted the skin on my face and pulled my eyes back, but she promised that the pain would subside and the style would last through the first days of my final years of high school back in the United States. The joy I felt that summer living in Jamaica quickly disappeared when I landed in Newark and learned that we had no place of our own to live. Eviction notifications stapled on the side of our apartment doors were not new to us. And because we were close in age, my mother had been a teenage parent, I was the kind of daughter who would say things like, you might want to tell your boyfriend to leave before it gets dark, hinting that the electricity had been cut off. But in the summer of 1993, my mother had just graduated from Rutgers University and had been forced to move out of family housing in Piscataway while waiting for a new housing assignment in Newark, where she would attend the university's law school. All of our belongings were in storage, and with few affordable options, we went to look at a homeless shelter in the neighborhood near my school. The director showed us the small room where we would stay, the bunk beds, the desks facing the concrete wall, and the shared kitchen and bathrooms. Only years later, when I was a volunteer at a homeless shelter in Washington, D.C., would I remember that the director had also outlined the rules residents had to follow about arrival and departure, laundry, room cleaning, food storage, etc. In fact, my feminist practicum paper in college focused on the middle-class gendered racial expectations that govern homeless shelter residents. During that tour, I had lost my focus, couldn't hear a thing that she said, and my mother's voice had become muffled and shaky. The first time I had seen her come close to tears. An immigrant in this country, life was not easy, but she was so-called doing the right thing, working hard. She worked hard as a nurse's aide, a supermarket cashier, a bank teller, and an insurance saleswoman. She paid high rents to live in good school districts, completed community college, then college, while working as a research assistant with Dr. Lennox Hines, her political science professor, famously known for defending Assata Shakur, and who she credits for encouraging her to pursue a career in the law. But in the homeless shelter, walking alongside her teenage daughter, she faced the harsh reality of being counted on any given day among the approximately 9,000 mostly invisible homeless people in the state of New Jersey. The inability to study late into the night or rest during the day, and perhaps the weight of the shame, especially the school bus picking me up and dropping me off, led her not to choose the shelter, which meant months of even more precarious living conditions until we moved into permanent housing. We felt at home in the Rutgers apartments on Bleecker Street in downtown Newark, located just a few minutes from Science High School, where I would complete my high school degree. But we were forced to move again when I turned 18 years old during my second year in college. I did not have the vocabulary then to understand how heteropatriarchy naturalizes social hierarchies, but I can see now how the university policy that married couples with no children, including with some with spouses who regularly lived elsewhere, could live in family housing while evicting an unmarried mother and daughter could represent the materialization of those hierarchies through the cruel negation of adequate housing. Although my mother fought against the eviction with the support of one of the law school deans, one of the few openly gay white men administrators at the time, my mother lost her case. The dean was fired shortly after, not sure if it was related, and we were forced to leave a rapidly gentrifying Newark. I archived those memories of my own family struggle with housing, but I went on to volunteer weekly at Calvary Women's Shelter in DC, and then at a homeless shelter for banished indigenous mothers in Buenos Aires while I was in college. By the time I integrated myself into the Gamboa de Baixo Neighborhood Association after graduation from college in 1998, and again a few years later to do dissertation research, Black women activists had already been engaged in a fierce struggle for land and housing rights and neighborhood improvement for almost 2 decades, beginning with the women's associations of the 1990s in the state of Bahia. The sharing of my personal story with and advocacy around the issues of homelessness in the United States facilitated a common political understanding emblematic of the kind of deep radical empathy I previously described as needed in feminist research, activist research. Having to repeatedly answer the question of why are you here and why do you do this political work made it easier to change my focus from the struggle for cultural recognition, as exemplified in a group such as ILIA, to a focus on the basic right to housing and collective land rights that were well on the way. The book I'm currently writing, Anthropology for Liberation, Research, Writing, and Teaching for Social Justice, includes a more detailed reflection on my own ethnographic experience in the Gamboa de Baixo neighborhood and explores how a focus on state violence, evident in territorial dispossession, as well as infrastructural abandonment in the process of eviction, everyday policing and criminalization to legitimize forced displacement, reveals the impact of collective racial subjection on Black women who are fighting for social justice and an end to the violence. The neighborhood became a classroom for understanding gendered racial subjection and anti-Black violence, evident in symbolic and physical walls in Brazilian urban communities. And I should say that I credit those activists as well for my learning Portuguese, although they won't take credit for any errors. The experiential knowledge of unequal cities gained in those political spaces had a direct bearing on my pragmatic ability to be an activist, to carry out feminist research and to produce anti-hegemonic knowledge. In essence, like Black women across the diaspora, I was not immune to the violence in the United States, such as my experience with homelessness, nor was I immune to the violence in Brazil. In my research, I've been preoccupied with emphasizing how and why Black women are the main political protagonists, mobilizing at the grassroots against forced removal and for police abolition, sometimes putting their bodies in front of bulldozers and the military police. That was the work I began to document in my first book, Black Women Against a Land Grab, The Fight for Racial Justice in Brazil, and I continued to write about in two other book projects, The Historical Paradox of Citizenship, Black Land Ownership and Loss in the Americas, and Evictions and Convictions, The Gendered Racial Logics of Black Dispossession. The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed just how urgent these discussions on housing, such as air quality, location, accessibility, affordability, still are. And I should say that many in my early years, even in graduate school, said that it wasn't a trendy, it wasn't an exciting project. But housing in this instance requires a more, I would argue, a more expansive understanding that takes us beyond the strict definitions of house and street. And I'll talk more about what I mean by that. Housing means communities, neighborhoods, schools, health centers, clean streets, clean air, sidewalks, parks, portable water, safety from police terror, and community violence, intercommunity violence, et cetera, right? So much more expansive understanding of how we understand housing or even land use. Even in the middle of a pandemic, when we look closely at the struggle against mass evictions, intertwined with the struggle for better public transportation and safe returns to public school, poor Black women are articulating critiques of racial capitalism and the impossibilities of racial democracy imbued in the logics of dispossession. The majority of Brazilian children, for example, have not had any type of instruction in over a year, not online and definitely not in person. As the articulação do Centro Antigo, or the articulation, or it's a social movement focused on the old city center of Salvador. As they wrote in a communique yesterday to mark the International Day of Women, March 8th, Black people continue, quote, Black people continue as a majority of the population living in vulnerable situations, being forced to leave their homes. With the COVID-19 pandemic, these historical violations of rights have even been more aggravated. And we see a series of threats to evict hundreds of Bahamian families. Black women have been historically a target of these structures marked by the patriarchal capitalist system. They're the ones who carry the weight as heads of household and who, in addition to working multiple shifts, they are also responsible for leading the resistance movements. So in that vein, Black women sustain their lives, their families, their homes, the hillsides, and I'm translating the word encostas, the buildings, old mansions they occupy, and communities with the force of their work and their struggle, always with the threat of removal knocking on their doors. Black women activists like those of the Articulação have been ignored in the scholarship on urban policy, design, and social movements in Brazil and the broader African diaspora, leading me to take on the questions: who's seen as a protester, who garners political sympathy? Ana Cristina da Silva Caminha, the president of the Gamboa de Baixo Neighborhood Association in Salvador. Maura Cristina, representative of the Articulação do Centro Antigo. What is understood as feminist and Black movements? Are activists from Bairro da Paz and Tororó mobilizing around housing or despejo zero or zero evictions? I argue that we should highlight the relationship between the racialization, or I should say that these movements highlight the relationship between the racialization and the feminization of poverty and the emergence of class-based anti-Black racism activism led by women. They are the political theorists who understand the complexities and particularities of Black women's participation in Brazil's anti-Black racism struggles that requires knowing their experiences in that country, specifically their predominant participation in domestic work, even after the recent implementation of affirmative action programs. Neighborhood-based social movements have become a crucial political site for Black women workers who are not generally expected to reshape policy or to engage in the global transformation of ideologies and practices of urban redevelopment. And I discussed that in much greater detail in the book Black Women Against the Land, in the Black Women Against the Land Grab. Right. In a recent essay I wrote focused on São Paulo activist Preta Ferreira, known as Janice Ferreira da Silva, and Carmen Silva, her mother, of the Roofless movement, I argued that we need to understand these women as both activists and political thinkers who advance the theories and practices of the Black radical and feminist traditions. Neighborhood activist and nurse Iracy Isabel da Silva, Dona Iracy, who died at age 45 from a heart attack after defending her grandson during a military police invasion in the Gamboa de Baixo neighborhood, was the first person to tell me that I could not understand urban redevelopment and forced displacement without taking seriously policing and police abuse. For her, or for Dona Iracy, police terror in Black neighborhoods, which include the destruction of homes, the brutalization of residents, and killings, work in tandem with mass evictions. Domestic workers, Rita Barbosa and Simone Bonfim, taught me about the intricacies of white supremacy and taught me to pay close attention to pay more attention to how gendered racial exclusion is built into the design and function of luxury real estate, to understand that efforts to modernize or Europeanize city centers already envision demolition and displacement, the disappearance of street vendors and prostitutes, intended to spatialize racial peripheries and margins that already exist. Black women workers are the main ones traversing the city each day on crowded buses and trains, entering gated communities and urban fortresses, and using service elevators and entrances. And for those of you who are following the Brazilian media closely, I'm sure you've seen two very famous photographs now during the pandemic. One is of bus riders who are, tightly holding on tightly on a bus, and then one that just came out just a few days ago. It's not taken inside the bus, it's actually taken from outside the bus. And you can see these women pressed against the glass, trying to survive their way home on public transportation, right? Benedita da Silva, Monica Benicio, Vilma Hayes, and other feminist scholar activists mobilizing right now around an end to feminicide in Brazil, for example, have centered the right to the city as a key feminist political agenda. Benicio, former partner of the assassinated Black queer sociologist and activist and city councilwoman, I should say, Marielle Franco, recently wrote, think of a safe city for women. To think of a safe city for women is to think about how the lack of good lighting in the street, the lack of public transportation, the vulnerability for assault and other points of poor busing and poor location, which may create situations of violence and everyday fear. It means extracting the vision or creating this vision or imagining urban mobility focused exclusively on transportation between home and work that makes women's daily and diverse forms of movement quite difficult. And they're the ones socially responsible for taking care of the children and the elderly. In other words, where you live, how you move about the city greatly matters. So March 14th, next week, will mark the anniversary of the brutal assassination of Marielle Franco, who was also a resident from the Maré neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro. In her scholarship and political work, she asserted that favelados, or people from the favela, should not just seek a place in politics, in formal politics, but that they should see themselves as embodying a unique political location on the margins of the city, state, and nation. Over the course of centuries, these urban communities have incubated a critical consciousness and militancy crucial for real social transformation amidst a system of racial apartheid governing the city. Particularly, Black women heads of household, lead community organizations mobilizing against the structural forces that maintain segregation and challenge the democratization of the city's resources. Black women workers move, and she would make the same argument as Benicio, move between the favelas and other peripheral neighborhoods to work in the most elite neighborhoods, fight for housing and labor rights, social programs such as daycare centers and infrastructural improvements, and systematically call for an end to the militarized police occupation that threatened their basic survival and material existence. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I'm trying to do in my work overall for those of you trying to follow in terms of making this connection between, like I said, a much more expansive understanding of housing as a human right, as a key part, as a key dimension of feminist thought and struggle, and certainly what it means to also connect those struggles to our understanding of basic infrastructure and other dimensions of the city. The core issues that Marielle Franco fought for follows in the legacy of the political ideas and works of the Combahee River Collective, the ideas of Luisa Barrios, Claudia Jones, and it's interesting because more and more I see the essay, An End to the Neglect of the Negro Woman, that sociologist Edilza Sotero and I translated to Portuguese, that it's being cited more and more, primarily because how people are seeing this idea of the Black women as being the most marginalized in these spaces, but how that militancy then leads, how that marginalization leads to a certain kind of militancy. So her ideas follows in the legacy and political ideas of the Combahee River Collective, Luisa Barrios, Claudia Jones, Vera Benedito, Tony Cade Bambara, among numerous others that have guided my own research, feminist research over the years. These feminist scholar activists have taught us that we need to return our social, scientific, and humanistic studies to these kinds of real material issues that concern the lives of the marginalized poor, as I've stated. For example, the Borel and Baixada massacres of 2003 and 2005, in which the military police killed a total of 33 people, fueled Marielle's early human rights activism. This political work also led her to write her sociology master's thesis, UPP, or the Pacifying Police Units, the Reduction of the Favela to 3 Letters, an analysis of public security policy in the state of Rio de Janeiro at the Federal University of Fluminense. The thesis documents Rio's poor residents' painful and constant struggle for life and freedom, and that despite the discourse of pacification and peacemaking, militarized police repression continued. Franco also described how policing became substantially worse for young people in the poorest districts after the staging of mega events that included the Olympics, the World Cup, and the Pan American Games. Even though the UPPs, or the pacifying units, were so-called justified as a way to create a new culture and manner of policing, different from the military police battalions, in 2017, they joined forces and escalated the process of the militarization of the city. Franco argued that the failure of the UPPs was a genocidal policy, and that brutalities felt in the daily lives of the residents of the favelas, primarily Black youth. The Paraisopolis Massacre of 2019 in Sao Paulo, which I've described in another essay, was one more example of the use of the militarized police violence, the use of tanks and soldiers in these neighborhoods that exacerbates and exposes the racism and the criminalization of poverty. And I've written more as well about the testing, what I consider these neighborhoods as testing sites for new military grade weapons. So you see military grade helicopters and other kinds of weapons being tested in these neighborhoods. Hence, the everyday policing that dehumanizes, humiliates, and lead to the death of women, such as Gamboa de Baixo activist Donaira C. and numerous others, the pacifying police units that are anything but peaceful, the military police invasions that have led to countless massacres. I understand Brazil to be occupied territory. It is a country at war, where it is important to repeat that every 23 minutes, a young Black person between the ages of 15 and 29 is killed, approximately 25 per day, 3 every hour, right? And 97% of police killings in Bahia, for example, were Black in 2020. And we keep repeating these numbers, and I should say Kristen Smith and numerous others, primarily to see in terms of garnering support in a way that other movements, such as the struggle for an end to the occupation of Palestine, has garnered support. So Kristen Smith and the Black Lives Matter movement in this country as well. So Kristen Smith, Ana Luisa Pinheiro Flauzina, Mao Chirio, Rebecca Atencio, and numerous other Brazilian scholars have and non-Brazilian scholars like Michael Mitchell, others, have documented that Black and brown people, Black and brown and poor people from the barracoons to the plantations, palenques, quilombos, favelas, and barrios have borne the brunt of militarized policing, technological innovation of surveillance and torture, and state sponsorship of mass killings. The struggle for housing is also about the right to live free of this violence and the constant threat of death. This has been further exacerbated in the past year by the almost 270,000 coronavirus deaths, right? And partly what I'm also interested in talking about and writing about is a much more extensive kind of notion of and what it means to live in certain locations and have access to healthcare, and even further, and later on we'll find out what happens in terms of vaccine distribution. Furthermore, anyone concerned with prison abolition, and that's another kind of area that I want to step into, as a basic tenet of Black liberation, must also take into consideration the growth of the prison industrial complex within and beyond US borders in its varied forms that may look like in-school suspension, house arrests with electronic surveillance devices, immigration detention facilities, or island penal colonies. Thinking through the abolitionist critiques of the prison industrial complex, Jemima Pierre's use of the term captive capital is important for us here because it makes clear that a transnational feminist understanding of the global lockdown that is now an extension of what we're living in, as Julia Sudbury asserts, means that discourses and practices of criminalization and the overrepresentation of Black and brown people, and now increasingly Black and brown women in penal institutions around the world, is related to, quote, an economic restructuring, unquote, of nation states and cities. Disenfranchised people, particularly the racialized and gendered poor, become commodities in a rapidly growing prison industry. In Brazil, Black activists are all too familiar with persistent proposals for profitable floating prisons to house the masses of poor people swept up in fine-tooth comb operations, or operações pente fino. And for those of you who write about urban violence know what that means. In these fine-tooth comb operations, in preparation for economically lucrative carnival festivities or mega sport events in Brazil's major cities. Poor people become captive capital in private prisons where states spend more to keep them locked up than to educate them in public school or to remove them from gentrify, or spend more to remove them from gentrifying or renewed neighborhoods for luxury real estate or tourist development, where their presence, other than as underpaid workers, are perceived as diminishing capital. Projects in the United States, such as $1 Million Hoods project led by Kettle Lighter Hernandez, map the fiscal costs of mass incarceration. And more recently, I've begun to map the correlation between rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods, militarized policing, and incarceration rates. And I'm interested, especially in the case of Brazil, how Black women, heads of household from particular neighborhoods, correspond to evictions and are fueling the rise in female incarceration. After almost 2 decades of focusing my research almost entirely on housing and land struggles against eviction and displacement in Brazil, and having documented how urban neighborhoods have become captive during militarized police raids, I want to end today by emphasizing that there is a global war on Black, Indigenous, and poor people, especially those fighting against social exclusion, to claim space in neighborhoods and in societies more broadly that understand them as security problems that should be eliminated. And Leslie Gill, for another anthropologist, have written about not just as security problems, but also enemies within. The global circulation of violent policing practices and technologies is what has led the police to the police killing, by their own account, of 3,148 people in the first 6 months of 2020. Brazil has the world's 3rd largest prison population of 811,000 inmates, behind China and the United States, which is almost at 200% capacity. Waterboarding, stop and frisk, and other forms of police and military torture have long been perfected on the bodies of Black and brown people elsewhere before becoming standard police practices in the United States. Architectures of confinement and punishment, such as school, public housing, and prisons, present the same challenges globally for the abolition movement. I would like to end by asking the question of what does it mean for us, what does it mean for the two countries? And I've expanded much of my work now to the United States and Jamaica. So if it sounds like I'm struggling to make that shift, it's because doing comparative work is not as easy as it seems. But what does it mean for the two countries with the largest Black populations in the African diaspora outside of Africa to have the largest prison populations? What does it mean for a democracy that invests so much public funds in displacing and eliminating Black and brown people from the everyday citizenry through mass incarceration, yet has been completely unprepared to house its population as a basic right? How do we globalize this conversation and see the fact that the vast majority of incarcerated Australians are Aboriginal born and should be, and we can connect this example to the Brumadinho and Mariana Dam disasters in Brazil, and connect those events as well to the Grenfell Tower fire, and connect them to the tragedies of Sandra Bland, the death of Latinx transgender woman Leilene Extravaganza, and that of Breonna Taylor, who was killed in her apartment located in an over-policed neighborhood undergoing rapid gentrification. Hence, there's a global pattern here where housing is the basic part of the human rights project. Where you live matters. Living in a poor neighborhood lessens your chances of having access to good public education, good health care, and something as basic as clean, lead-free drinking water. In poor neighborhoods in global cities such as Los Angeles, New York, and Salvador da Bahia, harsh policing is a first sign that gentrification is well underway. Colonization and settlement, whether it be in 1942 or 2021, does not occur without violence, primarily because Black, Indigenous, and poor people are always resisting being forced off their lands, out of their houses, off of their streets. When it comes to making the lives of Black lives and experiences of Black women visible, if we wait only to find them lying in pools of blood, cramped in overcrowded jails and prisons, we have failed to see them where they're struggling en masse to survive. Policing and mass incarceration do not happen in a vacuum. They're the chain effects that lead to mass incarceration, that also lead to that are part of violent police encounters. What kinds of trauma are Black women living with after they have been beaten on sidewalks for grilling, or in hallways for waiting for social services, shackled in hospital beds while giving birth, or losing their children because they have no place to live? The Cost of War project hosted at Brown University reminds us that the United States has spent over $6.4 trillion in post 9/11 wars that have cost the displacement of over 37 million people. The scholars of that project write, the wars, quote, the wars have been accompanied by violations of human rights and civil liberties in the United States and abroad, unquote. This is the same country where Malaysia Goodman, a 22-year-old, fell and died trying to carry her daughter down the stairs in a New York City subway. New York City, the same city where they spend more money on policing poor people who can't afford to pay the subway fare, where they spend more money policing poor people than they spend on providing safe public transportation. Where also landlords leave tenants without heat for years in an effort to push them out, and the struggle against eviction starts with demands for these kinds of basic infrastructural services, such as running water, that ensure human dignity. And I encourage all of you to watch the documentary by Kurt Otteson entitled Not in My Neighborhood, and where he looks at Sao Paulo, Cape Town, and New York. I want to encourage all of us to expand how we think about housing, displacement, state violence, and how it impacts the lives of those living on the socioeconomic margins, even as their neighborhoods have now become part of the coveted center. As my Brown colleague, as my colleague and former Brown colleague and Brown alumna, Adia Benton, recently asserted, perhaps the challenge for all of us in these carceral states fighting for territorial belonging through housing and land, and against police and our incarceration, perhaps the foundational idea is that Black disposability is the epidemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keisha-Khan, for
Thank you.
For a wonderful talk. So we'll open up the floor to questions. If you would use your raise your hand button, and we'll just follow the order. And we'll ask you to unmute as we call on people. Yaira?
Hello. So I'm based in Colombia, where we're facing a serious crisis right now, particularly in Buenaventura, which is a port town, historically Afro-descendant. There's just a series of massive displacements happening, paramilitary kind of armed group violence, forced confinement, where entire communities are essentially put in the middle of turf wars. And aren't able to access basic goods, as well as, having like this street fighting happening in front of them. What we're seeing is that there's a really strong narrative that the state pushes of kind of like essentially not taking ownership of the violence, which I think is something that also happens in the United States in a lot of predominantly Black and Latinx communities. And so I'm curious how we can kind of push narratives that implicate the state in the displacement and in kind of allowing the violence, because obviously while kind of abstractions can be made, it's difficult to find clear evidence to say the Colombian state is allowing these paramilitary groups, or the Colombian state is constantly reinforcing these colonial paradigms through land dispossession and displacement. So what are strategies that on the ground activists can use to kind of help communities on the front lines of this and interrupt the state's narratives?
Do you want me to just answer one at a time? Is that fine, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
however works for you.
All right, thank you, Yaira from Colombia. Great question, a difficult one. I'm not sure if I have an adequate answer for you, but what I would say is that comes up a lot in the communities where I've been working in solidarity for the last 2 decades, and especially the question even around intercommunity violence, right? And the conflicts that emerge. And I would say that part of what a lot of activists have tried to do is to think of a much more global sense in terms of, what kinds of resources do these young people, for example, have that prevents them from really kind of participating in the polity, or even just having access to basic resources that lead them to make decisions about basically engaging in forms of guerrilla warfare, which is in what these other forms of intercommunity violence looks like. So I think ultimately, that's the way they have shaped the discourse, and also denouncing all forms of violence. I think for most of the folks that I've worked with in terms of, and I'm sure in terms of the case of Colombia, that's the case where you have people are trying not to serve as any sort of bridge between the two groups, but certainly trying to distance themselves as much as possible, and to say they want to live in safe communities that are free of violence from wherever it's coming from, right? And that who's ends up kind of paying the price are Black people who are being forced to move, or Black people who are losing their lives. I think someone told me the case just a few days ago, and I didn't want to describe it in great detail here. It was quite disturbing, but how women had been completely, chopped up, and to say it crudely, and lost their life in the process, right? And what does that mean? What does it mean to speak out against that, but also understand that activists are risking their lives? I'm not sure if that answers your question well, but I do think there is the connection that people are making between state violence, intimate partner violence, even intercommunity violence, I think is is quite sophisticated in ways that say, look, we have to see them as interconnected and abolish all forms of violence, right? That's my simple answer. And I'll think about it. And if you want to reach out via email, we could talk more.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
I have a question about how you think in the United States the role of the federal government in housing might play out in maybe the immediate future and then maybe in the long term, maybe through potentially like what we're dealing with, how we have our current resources, then maybe through more of a visionary and anarchist lens. We have the HUD department and it is patchy, and many within HUD don't even think it's very effective. It's left to states to kind of patch together and figure out on their own. And I was just wondering how you see sort of the federal and state level housing situations for the provision of maybe like state or public housing playing out in the future.
This is the second time this has happened to me in the pandemic, but my computer is about to die, so I'm gonna have to run and get my phone cord in 2 seconds. But before that happens, we don't want that to happen. But I think that's an important question because I think what I've learned from people who are on the absolute margins is that it allows them to think about what is possible, right? So I think what I've learned from activists is that they don't think about it as, it's not an absolute, like we must have all of these things, but I do think that there's a sense of, what does it mean to participate in a social democracy that understands housing as a basic human right, that it should not be a commodity on the open market. So even and I didn't get into discussion here, but discussion around what is the alternative to being removed or being evicted is a program coming up with a design based on what they've learned from going to some of these international conferences organized by the UN, is how do you come up with a program that contemplates everyone staying in the neighborhood, right? So a social housing program. And so having it be the government's responsibility, just like public health, to socializing healthcare. And I think we're more familiar with, in terms of public education, that is not, and public health, that's not governed just by our taxes. But certainly this idea that housing should be considered as part of those programs. I think it was Anna Kaiser here at Brown who did a lecture a few weeks ago who talked about how housing is deeply tied to generational wealth in terms of the capacity to own and pass on those resources. But I think the main thing is, what does it mean to actually also have to socialize or to have a much broader sense of a buy-in? And I'm part of a group out of UCLA, as part of a housing justice network. I want to shout out those folks out there, Ananya Roy and numerous others. But I think, partly what folks, for example, in Barcelona have been doing and other places is they're talking about what does it mean if everyone has a sense of a buy-in? So poor people, the so-called middle class, so everyone have a sense that we shouldn't have to spend 60% of our income or 40, even that a significant percentage of our income on housing, or we shouldn't be mortgaged to death. I mean, that's pretty much the logic that we're currently living in, where we're mortgaged for 30, 40, years. And then we sell our house and we're mortgaged again. So the idea that would be part of our basic existence, where housing is subsidized or provided based on I guess need or however scale is determined. So I would say that it's a re-envision. I think what's nice about the last election is that we already started to get gung-ho about things like universalized healthcare, in the same way that housing shouldn't cost what it currently costs. And we see that it wasn't just poor management of healthcare, it was also where people live, is how they live, access to fresh air, access to public parks. those kinds of things, and what the schools look like, and then how those are interconnected. So I would say that if we see this as a collective responsibility, what kind of society do we want to live in? The state of Massachusetts, I don't know, at least recently, was spending $40,000 to incarcerate one person, right? What does it mean then to translate that into housing and the impact that then that will have on things like criminality and access to public education, et cetera, and generational wealth, et cetera, et cetera. Since housing is one of the most important kind of forms of stress and violences that people experience on an everyday, that shapes how they work, where they work, and all of the things that people interact with. I mean, if we think about even our own experiences, which is I was a little hesitant about sharing my own story, but I thought about how much housing had impacted our lives since we lived in this country, right? Living in neighborhoods just because the schools were better. And I can remember those thick staples. I don't know if anybody had those experiences, those thick staples on the side of the door, but we lived in those neighborhoods only because of the schools. So I think, if we think about these things as ideals of what we should be, that we should have, these are what we should be spending our money on. $6.4 trillion going to wars for so-called democracy, when democracy is really in housing and health and other things. Yeah, I'll stop there. Can I pause for 1 second while I grab the charger?
Of course.
All right.
Thank you.
Hi, again, I'm back. Thank you so much, Emma, for your question. My advisor from undergrad said I'm supposed to lie when things like that happen to me, but I don't know how to lie. I forgot my charger.
Thank you for your answer. And it was a very quick and smooth transition.
I ran things.
Sa.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Perry, for that phenomenal lecture. I do research in a similar area, so I was just so inspired and learned so much today. So I wanted to ask you sort of two interrelated questions. One sort of about Black women activists during your ethnographic work, and sort of wanted to know how some of those housing and land justice activists have connected their struggles against displacement or sort of neoliberal urban planning projects, real estate development, et cetera, to the context that other Black women are facing in other national contexts. Sort of pointing to the part of your lecture title as a global imperative. So I'm kind of curious how Black women activists in these different contexts are, one, trying to build solidarity across borders, but also I think thinking with your forthcoming book, my second question is, how are you doing that comparative work and thinking through Black women's relationships to sort of housing financialization, even policing in neighborhoods, right, gentrification across these very disparate regional and local contexts. So that's sort of maybe a question of a comparative question of scale, like how are you putting these different contexts in conversation?
I think that's another great question. So, as I said in the talk, I've been teaching for 15 years, and I taught a class in Brazil, and I have a class in urban politics that focuses primarily on the United States. Those kind of urban politics classes are always hard to teach comparatively. So I just decided I was going to focus on the US context, right? So I'm teaching a class on Brazil that's just about racial and gender politics. And I taught a class on urban politics, and I teach a class on social movements that's much more global, but it's in the teaching of the urban politics class and the Brazil class. And then later on, of course, I taught that along with Anani Eugenio. Is that when I realized that there was in both classes, in some ways, students in kind of fall into this idea around Brazil's exceptionalism. So the sense that Brazil is just terrible. They come to the class thinking they're going to find a racial paradise, and they're like, oh, it's worse than I thought. So I guess I can't go there. I guess I can't flee like Du Bois and all these other folks thought they could flee. And then flee the United States in terms of racial terror in the United States. And then the other ones were just, like I said, they either completely demystified or they start to fall into this language around, it's just worse. And then I basically became motivated to say, no, what happens if we started to look at diasporic connections and interactions rather than them being just separate experiences, right? So how, and I saw, well, how do you think about, so the move to do research in Jamaica and the United States really came out of that impetus to say, look, let's think about how these processes are connected. So, you know, you can't understand militarized policing and stop and frisk and all these things if you don't understand what's going on in one of the most important African diasporic contexts, right? So a lot of these, so for example, I'm interested in how a lot of these urban architects, urban planners, they're all being trained and thinking in very similar ways about how they organize and design cities and what sorts of inclusionary mechanisms that are deeply racialized are also circulating about what cities should and can look like, right? So it might be something as simple as, do you include public bathrooms, which is very gendered, of course. Most women can't just go to the bathroom anywhere. Or what does it mean then to completely, for example, to create benches where you can no longer sit, right? And you see those ideas, I mean, I went to a conference in Beirut, and they had this conversation in Istanbul, and you see that taking place in terms of in Sao Paulo, et cetera, where the very collective spaces are set up in a way that it prevents homeless people from just even sitting, right? So what does that mean? I think Ruha Benjamin has a fantastic lecture about how, and her book, of course, about how race is built into design, right? So I think that's something that I've been thinking a lot. So that's how the work, for example, on policing in New York is not simply about policing and gentrification in New York. It's basically about how those same people, like Rudy Giuliani, and technologies are circulating around the Americas, right? So you can see this playing out in Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro, Austin, Texas, being trained by Rio de Janeiro police forces, New York police forces, going to Sao Paulo, and you see the schoolism of the Americas being a key place where these ideas around security, technology, et cetera, are circulated in the same way that how you police neighborhoods, you carry out militarized force, and militarized tactics in neighborhoods are carried out similarly, right? In addition to things like the demolition of high rises that make it easier to traverse certain public housing projects, et cetera. So I think that's partly what I'm thinking about in terms of how to see the connections rather than to say in New York, this happens, in Sao Paulo, this happens, in Salvador, this happens, and to understand that if we're gonna fight for abolition, we're gonna have to consider all of these communities all at once, right? And if Black women are heads of households and their children are dying, or they themselves are being thrown on sidewalks for grilling or at barbecues, or for crossing outside of the crosswalk, that is the same ways of dehumanizing Blacks that those ideas are circulating around the Americas, right? So the basic idea about who's the human and what is the human is quite global. So I would say that. So I would say a lot of the conversations, and you see Marielle Franco and others who are learning English and reading documents, you see a lot of those conversations about racial capitalism, people are reading widely. What you find is that Brazilians are reading more US feminists, US scholars, Black scholars of the Black radical tradition, versus the other way. And partly what I'm trying to do in my work is to say, look, I start out being trained politically and intellectually in Brazil, and that allows me to see the United States differently. I think if I hadn't been doing this work in Brazil, I would have never really cared about, I mean, I would have, but I wouldn't, for example, how globalized policing is taking place in New York, because it was so much an intrinsic, such a key part of my everyday experiences in Brazil and the everyday part of their lives, right? In a way that it is here, but not as at the same scale. At Brown, I brought activists from Salvador. I brought a lot of activists, intellectuals to speak at Brown over the years, but certainly to be in dialogue with each other. So, the books I write could easily have been about Boaventura. It could have been about anywhere. It could have been about Kingston. It could have been about anywhere in the Americas for that matter. So I brought activist scholars to campus, for example, to speak in conversation with each other. So activists in Brazil to speak. So Francia, Marcus came to speaking with activists from Colombia and Brazil together, from Puerto Rico, et cetera, to have conversations. So I think the idea is to exchange knowledge about what they're experiencing, but also to think about just key strategies in terms of how they're mobilizing in different contexts. So those, I think, are important questions. Again, when I present a paper, and this is one of those instances where I said, okay, I'm going to try to just focus on Brazil. When I present a paper that focuses on Brazil, Jamaica, and the United States, not only is it mentally exhausting and my accent changes from each context, but I think you start to see how difficult it is to really be attuned to the particularity of each geographic location, but also understanding that these processes they're hemispheric, right? There's a hemispheric Blackness, but there's also a hemispheric anti-Blackness being governed by police and technologies, security firms, et cetera. I believe it was Giuliani's security firm that was hired to organize for the World Cup and the Olympic Games. So I think Nicole had her hand up. I'm not sure. Thank you so much, Sai, and we'll talk soon.
Of course, thank you too.
Hi, thanks so much. I just wanted to follow up with a question that I think it was maybe part of Sa's first question. I appreciate your talk so much from all angles, like the activism, the bringing activists into spaces of the academy. So I commend you for the work you're doing. But I guess my question was, my history is working with MST in Bolivia and then in Brazil, and now I'm doing housing justice work in Baltimore. So I also am thinking about kind of tracing similar geographies. And I wonder what the sort of interdigitation of rural landless politics is with urban. So thinking about value has been really useful for me, like speculators in value and the ways in which the latifundio, right, is waiting to kind of flip the land in the same way that the urban gentrifier is waiting to kind of flip the houses, and sort of how and in what ways movements kind of coalesce around this. Like for MST, it's using their bodies in a very radical form. And oftentimes I was present when the paramilitary intervened to displace indigenous peoples. So I think we do see this crisscrossing. Is there an interdigitation in Brazil? It's been very powerful for me to bring Bolivian landless activists to spaces in Baltimore to talk about land politics, right? And to, evoke these rural urban kinds of imaginaries of what could be possible across those spaces. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that. And what solidarity, I guess, could look like for Indigenous and Black organizers across those divides.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you in general for your work, which I'm familiar with. And it's weird with the Zoom because I couldn't quite see your face if I was like searching, trying to figure out how to find you on this thing. But thank you so much for your question. So there are a couple of ways that I dealt with that dealt with that in my work. One is to look at the activist trajectories. And what I found is that it's impossible to talk about this work without talking about migration, and the migration from rural areas into cities. So what you find is that women like Dona Iracy came from Jacobina, where she was already an activist around questions of land with and the Catholic Church, right? Supported by the Catholic Church. And you see those very violent land struggles in the rural areas, mobilizing folks that might lead to the death, for example, of nuns and priests, as we know that history. But those people also migrate to cities, right? And then they also influence the politics in cities. Now, there's also another part of it that I've been trying to follow during the pandemic, which is all of the activism from MST, just in terms of feeding the urban population, right? So a real opportunity in terms of, or just part of the activist ethic about growing food and providing food in a moment when the state itself has failed urban communities, right? So you see that kind of solidarity taking place. But in terms of the broader history, you see solidarity between rural movements and urban movements all the time around land. And I think that's part of the language, even around land, that is not commonly used in the United States to talk about urban housing, right? About where you're located, right? It's also meaningful. And in the case of even places like New York, what does it mean to own a city block, or to want to belong to certain geographic spaces that are shaped by, for example, city parks, sidewalks, et cetera. So I think those languages around even occupying or occupation, and I've spoken about that, I've written about that in other writings, comes out of some of those movements. What does it mean to occupy land that you're not using and give new meaning to it, not in a capitalist frame, but in a way that makes it, for example, to grow food. In a way that urban occupiers in buildings in Sao Paulo, for example, occupy empty, basically wasteland, vertical wastelands, and give new life to those wastelands, right? In the same way that occupiers in the rural areas have. So you see strategies being, circulating in that way, right? But I do think that the idea of immigration is really important. Carmen Silva is from Bahia. So is Preta Ferreira. And you see, for example, folks from Bahia moving to places like Sao Paulo. What is that immigrant experience of movement, and as well as marginality, how that impacts the activism, or your even experience with houselessness. I haven't quite fine-tuned this narrative that I'm trying to work with, but what I find is that this movement, because of immigration, and then you, like, for example, in our case with my family, it's like you're forced to move, there's an economic push, then you come to the States, it is so unequal in terms of geography and schooling and so forth, and then you're constantly being forced to move in order to access just the basic right to live in dignity, to live in a safe space. So even, I can give you an example now, my mom still lives in New Jersey, in one of the most expensive areas, paying exorbitant amounts for housing, just so her kids could go to one of the best high schools in the state. So you see that a lot, but you also see Black women being incarcerated because they use the address of a family member in a good school district. You see those kinds of things taking place as well, right? So how the housing piece is still at the center, right? But at the same time, we've privatized, we're still willing, the state itself is still willing to pay so much to incarcerate the poor rather than to remedy their housing conditions. And my mom obviously now is a lawyer. She tells the stories of, and I was thinking to myself, please, Lord, don't let her log into this Zoom. She's gonna hear me telling this story. She tells the story about how people lose their children over poor housing all the time. They lose their, she said she had to argue a case around bed bugs. And we know how bed bugs circulate in particular conditions, right? She said she had to do research on bed bugs to make the argument that it wasn't viral. it was an insect, right? People lose their children because they have bunk beds instead of single beds, right? They don't have enough beds for their children, or they're sharing a bed with their children. So the housing question, people lose their children for not having running water and electricity. She always tells me the story that, she would have lost me. I don't know if that's a good thing, but she would have lost me back in the day just based on the conditions we were living in oftentimes, right? So I think the housing struggle is just touches on so many different issues. Yeah, I think there's so much that you asked, Nicole, that I could talk about, but thank you.
We're going to talk offline because I have so much more, but we'll have a separate conversation.
Yeah, thank you. But I like the question about value, which I have to touch on a little bit more at another time.
We'll talk at some point, but this was wonderful.
Thank you so much.
So nobody else has a question, I'll have a quick question on, so right now in Brazil, there's this, right, we're looking at an erosion of social democracy with the government, et cetera, that's going on. And a lot of these movements, right, the social movements that are happening are really where democracy is kind of, it's flowering, it's really holding on, I guess you'd say. And that's just being, that's what's kind of being said, et cetera. So we have a rise, I mean, we've seen a pretty big up in, right, candidates across the board who are running for office, Black women, trans candidates, et cetera. But then also we're seeing post-elections a massive surge in violence with everyone. And I was just wondering if you could kind of comment on that, right? I mean, the government and how that tension that's there, right? Because it's involvement in this social democratic, right, experiment, if you want to say, but there's this undermining and this pushing back. And I mean, sometimes it gets very weighty to think about, because it's the positive on it, you're seeing it in an expansion, and then also the violence that with which society and the government is responding, which you have outlined in some ways.
Yeah. You know, it's that's a good question, Jeremy. So a few years ago, and you know, the photograph that I have on my Zoom, I had to figure out how to find it again because my son had a picture of himself on there playing hockey. But the picture of us is that picture is at the Lula Institute in Sao Paulo. For those of you who can recognize the background. And it's interesting because there have been circulating videos in the past couple of days of Lula getting ready physically. And I was like, okay, Lula's putting the rest of us to shame in terms of fitness in the pandemic, but he's getting ready for the next election of 2022, I believe. And I thought that was really fascinating because I was thinking to myself, wow, like who are the other people who would have been prepared to do this? And you know, some people responded online that it would have been Marielle, for example, could have been one person that we can imagine. And I would say it's probably more in the realm of the imagination, because I don't know if there's any, you know, Black female candidate at that level that people would put forward as, you know, the candidate. I mean, you can even get a Black woman from the left in terms of, you know, with a long tradition in social movements, you know, to represent the party in places like Bahia, right? So I think, where there's a large Black population, I think, you know, I think it's really troubling. So when we were in Sao Paulo, we were asked by LASA to investigate the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. So I was part of a team of folks who went to ask folks like Lula, Dilma, et cetera, team of lawyers, so many folks that we interviewed, wonderful, fantastic interviews. If any of you are interested in that report, as well as all of the archival material now at the University of Campinas. And what came out of all of those interviews, which I was absolutely amazed by, that no one had to bring it up, is that everyone, white, Black, everyone, activists, non-activists, lawyers, politicians, everyone brought up that among one of the most important conquistas or victories of the Social Democratic Project advanced by the Workers' Party was affirmative action. That getting more Black students into the university was one of the most important gains and one of the most damning in terms of how people viewed the society in terms of, so people said, if you go back to the debates around affirmative action is when you will see precisely when people started to get more violent and started to turn. There was a pushback on what does it mean to have 40%? So Brazil right now is up to about, then it said 53% counting Blacks in the population. What does it mean to have 40% in public universities that are, you know, the most important place for social mobility, but also for access to knowledge and education about citizenship, resources, rights, etc. So you have a whole generation. I will never forget this. And Lula's, you know, if I were Brazilian, I'd be like, you got my vote. Lula, I remember in the meeting saying something to the effect of, what does it mean when you have Black people going to university, including the woman who was working at his office serving water, all of a sudden saying, no, I have rights, you know? And I want access to the society that is, the resources of the society that is rightfully mine. And that's when you start to see a real breakdown in, how people including on the left of who should and can belong in the Brazilian society. So you see, so basically a lot of the Black activists were not surprised. Some people went as far as to say there was a race war. I'm not sure if everyone agreed with those terms, but I would say race is at the core. And that's why, and race, gender, and sexuality. And that's why you have a Marielle Franco. And I wrote a separate paper on the rise of the right, and for those of you who are interested, but there was a sense that, these folks are attacking, they're breaking down what is order and progress. They're breaking down an understanding of what are the right gender relations, what are the right sexualities that should be included. And you have this lesbian woman on the left who wants better public transportation. She wants to connect neighborhoods. She wants people to have daycare centers. She wants people to access, education and all these other things, representing that project. So I think, I think most folks are trying to make a lot of kind of variety of arguments about how this to take place. But those interviews, almost everyone spoke to the significance of not diversifying education, but to actually put Blacks in university seats and have folks be educated about what it means to belong. And he, as Lula said in one of his things, I'll never forget, he said, it's like, which I'm vegan, so I don't really care about meat, but he said, what is it, if you give somebody meat and then you tell them you can't eat it anymore? So he's like, that's what in essence affirmative action did. And he said, all of a sudden, you had Black people on the planes. You had, if anyone who's been to a Brazilian university over the course of 2 decades understands the difference from when I started going in the late 1990s to now. I can't even fathom when I walk into a university class from the University of Bahia of how different it looks, right? And how that transformed not just materially in terms of access to employment and social mobility, but what does it mean just in terms of a level of consciousness. And we see that difference in other places like Cuba and Jamaica. For example, in Jamaica, where the vast majority of university students now, I think it's like 85% or 70, it's a high number, are women, right? And what it means. And we see that even at Brown, post Louise Lanphier, what it meant to, hire 100 women all at once, so we know what that kind of level of affirmative action does. And transform an institution and why it created levels of fear and reaction.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one quick final question. Yeah. Eva has her hand up.
Hey. Answers, sorry.
Hello, thank you so much for your energy and your knowledge. I was really happy to hear about your lecture from Twitter, and I'm pinging in from Taiwan, and it is currently 2:30 where I am, and I knew I had to be here, and I was right. So I was just wondering if you could share your thoughts and any of your experiences of how marginalized groups can build relationships with each other, especially when systems and processes like white supremacy and racism specifically aim to tear us apart from one another and vilify us to one another and dehumanize us from one another. So I'm just wondering if you could share your thoughts on that. And also, how do you see us moving towards respecting one another's boundaries in the sense of, I know this is your home, without needing to own any space in the capitalist sense?
Yeah. That's a great question on the last one. I think there's a new book called On Property that just came out by a scholar in Canada. I believe it's Ronaldo Walcott. I'm looking forward to reading that myself. And there's obviously a lot of Indigenous scholars who have been writing about what does it mean to kind of work outside of the framework of settler colonialism in terms of possession. And I think partly even in the term, using the term dispossession, I think what I'm trying to understand is not necessarily how Black communities and Indigenous communities in the Americas are trying to possess, but in terms of their reclaiming of space, in terms of a capitalist sense, but it's really a sense of community and collective belonging. So even in the communities that I work, a lot of the discussion and the language around rights and land rights are in collective sense. For those of you who may not know, the city of Salvador, for example, the Catholic Church owns the majority of that land in terms of, and the military, of course, all the way out into the ocean. So the sense that the land back is really in a very material sense in terms of who actually gets to use the space freely for their own sustenance. Things like fishing, swimming, those kinds of things, to occupy, grilling on the sidewalk, to occupy space. I think it's a way to rethink how we use the space communally, than that we have to, and there's another book that just came out about how we mark, and you see that more now with the coronavirus, these stickers on the ground, how we're now marking and delineating space in a way that is to further kind of segregate us. And I would love to see how that's going to continue moving forward. Are we going to keep all the plexiglass? Are we going to keep, all of these things? So I think that's something to think about. What does it home mean? Not in the material sense, but what does it mean to belong, especially for folks of the African diaspora, and Dion Brand writes about this, that just want to land. They want to put their feet in the sand. They want to feel like they don't have to be forced to move. Most displaced people, the 37 million people who've been displaced by wars, climate change, et cetera, don't want to leave their homelands, right? But what does it mean then once you've had to move? What does it mean to then want to plant your feet and belong somewhere? And I think that's something that it's about that kind of sense of territorial belonging, not the sense of owning territory. You see that well articulated among activists, for example, in Colombia. The question around, working together in terms of bringing together marginalized groups, that's a much more difficult one. There's a scholar out of, if you write to me via email, I'll find it. There's a scholar out, I think it's University of Wyoming, that wrote an article about half-connected humans. And what does it mean for us to think about a lot of the violences as a response to us half-connecting to each other? I would love to find that piece and send it to you. So if you send me an email, I'll follow up about that. But I think it's a much more complicated thing. I think partly what I'm trying to reach, trying to do, and why I started off with that personal story as well, is to think about what happens when you develop an ethic about, because I didn't even think about all of the volunteer work that I was doing and all the activism I was doing as an extension of my own kind of radical care and empathy around the loss of housing. And that led me, for example, in Buenos Aires to be doing work with the homeless in Buenos Aires, or banished teenage mothers. So I think, there's a way of thinking about how we connect with each other in ways that might break down some of these walls along kind of race, class, gender, sexuality, geographic location, et cetera. And thank you so much. I really appreciate the fact that you've taken the time to watch all the way from Taiwan. When I said good evening, I thought it was like a few hours ahead. I didn't know you really were several hours ahead. So I really appreciate it. And I want to say, again, a special thank you to the students who are here, faculty, my colleagues at Brown, again, Jeremy Lennon for inviting me, the folks at the Pembroke, all the folks involved in advertising the event, and putting together all the materials. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Keisha-Khan, for a wonderful presentation. I'm just going to give a quick plug to this evening. We have a discussion with Joyce Prado, the filmmaker, on the film Chicote Entre Nós. If you're available, interested, shoot me an email. It's floating out there for viewing. It'll be available, the film, until 5 o'clock, but touches on some of these questions with the MST, right, Black movement in Brazil, etc. So if you're available and interested, drop me an email and I'll send you all the materials. So
thank you so
all right.
much.
Thank you to everyone.
All right, have a good day.
Cheers.